I want you to talk about Putin a little bit, because you know him better than most Americans. I was struck by a passage in your book when you were talking to me at the St. Petersburg Forum in 2007. It sounds like it was just the two of you, and you describe his paranoia back then.
Yeah.
And that really jumped out at me, because I get to Moscow much later, 2012, when it seemed like that was a turning point. But
yeah.
Man, there was a bigger predicate there. So talk about the way you think about him, and then two other pieces of it that really struck me in your book. You write, page 286, Putin was an apostle of payback.
Still is.
That jumped out at me, and thinking about what happened in our country. And I think somewhere towards the end of that chapter, you end it this way, which was very powerful for me. It says, page 292 for those following, because we're being recorded, so I'm making sure they can follow. Diplomacy could open doors or prevent them from slamming shut, but ultimately others had to decide whether to walk through them. Is that Putin, or is that Russia? Was there a different Putin that you knew earlier that then got harder to deal with? How would you describe Putin as the person and his role that he plays in U.S.-Russian relations?
Well, Putin, in my experience anyway, and it's hard to believe, but Vladimir Putin has been Russia's leader for almost 20 years now. And Putin is a kind of combustible combination of grievance and ambition and insecurity all wrapped up together. And I vividly remember my first meeting as the newly arrived U.S. ambassador in Moscow, and you went through the same thing, Mike, I'm sure, where you go to present your credentials at the Kremlin, which is a letter from the U.S. president you give to the president of Russia. And so the Kremlin, as many of you know, is built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you go walking through these huge ornate halls down long corridors. You come to the end of one hall. There are these two-story bronze doors. And you're kept waiting in front of the doors for a little bit just to let all this sink in. And then the doors crack open a bit, and out comes Vladimir Putin, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is not the most intimidating person in the world. He's about 5'6", but he carries himself with great self-assurance. So he looks you dead in the eye, and of course, before I got a word out of my mouth, let alone handed my letter over, he said, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." That was vintage Putin in my experience. It was not subtle. It was kind of defiantly charmless, but it was quite direct. And it reflected his view that Russia wasn't going to get pushed around anymore.
Right.
I'm not trying to justify or rationalize that view, but if you want to understand the smoldering aggressiveness that today is Putin's Russia, you first have to understand, the chaos and disorder of Boris Yeltsin's Russia, out of which I think Putin's worldview was shaped. He came to power determined to do two things. One was to restore the power of the Russian state in a very repressive way, and the other was to restore Russia to its place at the table of great powers. And it became an article of both conviction and convenience for him to point to the United States as the enemy at the gate.